I need you to suspend your disbelief just for a second and imagine I am Mick Jagger, and I'm on a US tour going across small venues across the US. I've just arrived in Wilmington, Delaware at the Queen Theater, and we're playing a concert. And while they're serving cold beverages in the back, they're also serving hot coffee. And someone orders a hot coffee, walks through the crowd, bumps his elbow, and drops the cup of coffee on people, and these people have minor burns. So what happens next? We're in America. You get sued. So what happens is they sweep the street. They try to sue everyone they can. They try to basically name the artist. They try to name the touring company. They name the venue. And the wonderful thing in this world we take for granted a lot of times is limited liability. So the artist, even though they own the touring company, haven't done anything wrong directly, and they're protected from liability, so they can get out of the lawsuit. The touring company, though, that's actually running the show, if they're not adequately insured, may be responsible if they're ultimately held liable. And so it's all those deep pockets. It's the deep pocket from all the money that came from their whole tour, not just the venue that was the Queen Theater in Wilmington. It was all across the United States. That is basically a big pool of assets that creditor now has access to. And what I'm here to share with you is there's another way to do it. And there's a conventional way that most of you are familiar with, and that's you set up separate companies. So you set up an LLC, let's say, for every venue. And so the Queen Theater would be in its own particular container, and that way the assets associated with this are only basically going to that creditor, not any of the other assets from the tour. So that's exciting, but it's really cumbersome, and not many people go out and set up hundreds of LLCs for the US tour. But there's an easier way there may be an easier way, and what if there was an easier way? Well, I'm here to tell you there is, and it's called the Series LLC. It's a particular type of LLC that Delaware invented in 1996, and it's a way to take one LLC and break it down in its component parts. So if you have a problem with one aspect of the company, that company, that particular protected series, isn't necessarily responsible for everything else that happens against the company. So if you have a problem in one, let's say at the Queen venue, they can't go against the assets elsewhere, that's tour revenues. And this is surprisingly common. Even Bruce Springsteen in 1977 had a tour, and it was just after a dispute with his business manager, and he decided to call it the lawsuit tour. And so this is very common to get sued in the United States. And so what people do, like I say, is separate out these liabilities. But the exciting thing about this Series LLC is that it's really not limited to just Delaware. Delaware was the first state to have it. 13 states have adopted it since then. And then the Uniform Law Commission, which is an organization that gets together and creates laws across the US, just enacted an act that's trying to unify the way these laws are created. So before I tell you about, a little bit more about the Series LLC, I want to give you a little bit of an explanation on limited liability in the United States, because we take it for granted. 200 years ago, if you were to invest in shipping, in a sailboat going across the ocean, the owners were personally responsible not only for the cargo and the ship, but everything that went wrong. It ran into a dock, or if it ran into another ship, the owners are responsible. So they're afraid to take risks. And the nice thing about this limited liability system, it's a bargain with the government, where the government wants to encourage commerce. They let you basically limit your risk. And there was a case about 200 years ago called the Rebecca. It was the first time the courts established the principle of limited liability, where if there was a problem with the ship, they said the owners weren't responsible for anything beyond their investments. And that was really revolutionary. The next major revolutionary thing that happened in the incorporation system was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So you may be familiar with, after the Civil War, there were 3 amendments. The 14th Amendment, what it did is it took people and made them into citizens. And you may think, well, those are human beings. Well, guess what? According to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case about 20 years after that, which was Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, the justices got together before the oral argument, and they said, as soon as the oral argument started, we don't want to hear any arguments about whether this railroad is a person, because we all agree this railroad is a person. And so what's happened as a result of that is the 14th Amendment has allowed states to innovate their corporate laws. So there is no federal corporation law. It's all state by state. And the advantage is you're entitled to equal protection under the law. So if you incorporate in Delaware, you're allowed to use that business in California. You're allowed to use that business in Arizona. You can go to any state you want and do business there. And the exciting thing is the internal affairs are governed under the state where it's set up. So it's governed under the state of Delaware. So these states can sort of innovate, and it's like the laboratories of democracy. All 50 states can kind of innovate and determine what they think is the best law. And Delaware has been way on the forefront. So you're all familiar with big companies, why they're incorporated in Delaware. And partly it's because they had great corporate laws when corporations were first getting started. And so they've developed this whole trend of case law through the Court of Chancery, which is a special business court without judges, with judges without juries. And so it's an exciting time to basically to incorporate in Delaware and do business elsewhere. But corporations became a little old-fashioned. They became a little staid. You had stockholders, you had directors, you had officers, you have all this bureaucracy of meetings. And so in 1977, the state of Wyoming invented something called the LLC, the Limited Liability Company. And it was slow to take off, very slow, in fact. In fact, Delaware, which is known for being first, wasn't quite last, but they waited until 1991 to have their own law. Now, we're no longer in this world where corporations are controlling all the new entities. Now, LLCs are being formed 3 or 4 to 1 compared to corporations. And so it's not uncommon to have corporate law basically shift to a new form of entity. And what I'm here to talk about is why are you using a boring old corporation or a boring old LLC when you could be using a series LLC to protect multiple assets, where you can set up one LLC and have these internal chambers within that. It's like a safe deposit box, right? So you go to the bank, if you go into a vault and everything's lined up on the walls, it's available to everyone. But you can have little boxes with keys within this one company, where if you have a judgment against the company, you have to get a judgment against that particular protected series in order to get the assets. And so it's a way to segregate out these assets. And real estate investors are using it so that they can set up, let's say, 10 properties. Instead of having 10 LLCs, they may set up Series LLC with Protected Series 1, Protected Series 2, Protected Series 3. And they can internally, it's really exciting, they can establish these series without having to go back to the Secretary of State. So it empowers you to literally create people without even the further government authority. So you are allowed to basically create as many people as you like. And you may say, well, John, 10 LLCs, okay, I understand 10. But there's series LLCs out there with 100,000 series in them. They're not limited to a handful of series. And so this world we're moving into with entities, this is a new type of entity that's going to be really exciting, that's already being used. There's about 100,000 series that are already filed. Of those, we don't know how many protected series are out there. But this is going to be an exciting world because regular businesses, whether it's an entrepreneur that's a serial entrepreneur and they want to incubate different businesses, or whether it's a real estate investor, or maybe even big businesses. Let's say you had autonomous vehicles and you have every vehicle in its own series. Or you have Getty Images and they've got different copyrights and every copyright goes into its own series. It's a way to revolutionize the way we think of entities, where entities aren't static. Entities are constantly evolving, and the organization is actually becoming a new organization as it acquires assets. And it may not even be people that establish these new organizational assets. It could be the companies themselves automating this process with artificial intelligence to establish rules, to say that as it acquires an asset, we're going to create a new series, fund the series, keep track of the records in that series. And we may even use further technology to bulletproof that, so people don't accuse us of mischief. We're going to use this thing called the blockchain, where you can basically put things on a public ledger or a private ledger where you can't change it over time. So anyone goes back and questions what assets were owned when someone dropped the coffee, you can prove definitively. And this is a real innovation in risk. It's a real innovation in basically trying to mitigate the risks associated with deep pockets. It turns those deep pockets into little pockets, and it isolates liabilities to only those assets that really should be at risk, and allows businesses to really do things that are beyond the scope of what they've ever been able to do before. And like I say, it's only 1% of the new LLCs now. We've got 13 states that have it. We've got a uniform law that just came online. Delaware was the first state to have it. And it's just really exciting that anyone can use these. But you haven't heard about it because they don't teach it in law schools. They don't teach it in business schools. You don't read about it in entrepreneurship books. This is something that's not well publicized. That's why I'm here to basically share with you and invite you to look into the Series LLC to determine whether that's something you would think about using, or maybe someone you know, because the limit is your imagination. The number of series limit is your imagination and your ability to keep track of the records. So I'm going to ask you not to think big about business, but to think small.